Welcome to Lesson 12. This is one of two lessons on reading. So much needs to be said that I decided to make two shorter lessons rather than one long one. One does not have to think deeply about education more than a few minutes to conclude that reading is the most important skill a person learns. If you can't read, you can't do history, math, science, or any other topic that is taught from books. You cannot grow as a person, read the laws and regulations, and will be either uninformed or at the hands of someone to read for you, which is very hard on your ego. As a nation, we do not do well in reading. None of the assessment exams already discussed show good skills or improvements in reading. The assessment of adult competency shows that illiteracy has increased in the last few years, growing from 19 to 25% of high school graduates. This means that 25% of our nation's high school graduates have the reading skills of a 10-year-old child. Now let's listen to what I said in my talk about reading.
The whole situation we're talking about here, that people go to school, people teach school to a large extent because of intrinsic motivation. Teachers have extrinsic motivation in the form of salaries, but if you're a teacher, for the most part, you're dedicated. It's a calling, and it's intrinsic motivation that does that. And I'm going to talk about reading. All right, the best model that I have seen of intrinsic motivation comes from the University of Rochester, and it was done in the 70s. And there are three basic needs: competency, ability to do something well; autonomy, exercise control over one's life; and then relatedness, being on a good team, being a member of a good family, being a member of a good club. Those are the three things that they think motivate us. And that's why a lot of us, why are we here today? You know, you get some competency from the speakers usually. We usually gain knowledge. Autonomy, you don't have to come. That gives you some autonomy. You don't have to pay for the meal unless you come. And relatedness, it's a good club. I enjoy my table back here, my colleagues, and it's intrinsically motivating. So we're going to keep that in mind now. Reading. When you look at the stats and so forth, we do not produce good readers in America. I got one more point that a large number of just aren't reading proficiently. But reading, as we all know, is a topic of obvious and critical relevance to learning. I had a long phone relationship with a teacher down in San Antonio, Texas, and she said, "Dick, reading is everything. If you can't read, you can't do history, you can't do math, you can't do English, you can't do all of those things. So if a child doesn't know how to read, they don't learn." So if a child is not reading at grade level by the end of the third grade, just an ordinary student, they're 4 times less likely to graduate. And if they come from the poor strata, they're 6 times less likely to graduate. So I'll explain a little bit of that why. There is an undeniable connection between literacy skills and incarceration rates. So I usually don't talk about downstream stuff. You know, I worry about getting the kids educated today. But if you look at that little chart there, the 20% is the 20% that used to prevail in terms of competency, which should now be upgraded to 25, but I don't have a graphic that does that. So I use this at 20% of the children are functionally illiterate. Now that should say 25%. The next one says 70% of these kids, I meant read it off here. I can't read it off here. There is a strong relationship between reading skills and ended up in jail for whatever. So, social promotion. I had a focus group interview with a bunch of folks from the group called Fathers and Families, which is Eskenazi Health System organization. And they just happened to all be black because I talked to the leader of the thing about how are black attitudes about education. And we had a focus group interview, and one of the questions was, how do you feel about social promotion? And they, what's that? So I had a guy that was running the meeting, and he explained to him what social promotion was, where you advance a child even though they are not competent in the skills they should have learned in the 3rd grade, you move them on to the 4th grade. And once they heard that, they just rebelled against it. Absolutely not. You cannot advance those kids unless they're ready. So social promotion, you got somebody that's going to leave the 3rd grade, they can't read at anywhere close to 3rd grade level, and you promote them, and what happens? Go back to the intrinsic picture. Their competency does not grow. The red thing on the one end, their competency doesn't grow. Their intrinsic motivation dies, and they die on the vine. And they're in class, they know they're lost, and some of them quit. Very few of them graduate. So that's why intrinsic motivation, if you don't keep the competency level up, they are not going to want to stay in school because, they can compete if you do. Every child can learn to read. Can every child learn to read? So I asked myself, and I did a lot of research, can every child, why do we have so much trouble with reading in this country? Maybe there is something wrong with some of our brains that we just can't read. We don't know how to read. And I couldn't get anybody to answer that. And I talked to a psychology friend of mine down at IU who was Professor Buddy, and he said, no, he doesn't think that's true at all. But then I found a study that low IQs are capable of being taught to read. They took a group of kids that had pretty low IQs, and they taught them how to read. Well, the way I look at that, my analytical perspective, is if we can educate the lower tail, then we ought to be able to educate the rest of the distribution. And that's what I say now. So if we are not teaching them how to read, it's our fault. It's the parents' fault. There's nothing wrong with the kids. One teacher's dilemma. This is my daughter-in-law. She came over last night. We watched the Super Bowl together. She's a kindergarten teacher at a Marion County school. She has 26 students. 17 of them come to school with what she calls no print concepts. They can't identify the front of the book. They don't know how to read from left to right. They have no idea how to approach the text from the bottom up, from the top down, from the right to the left, or whatever. They have no feeling for that whatsoever.
Let's expand on the items I talked about. From the New York Times, the performance of American teenagers in reading and math has been stagnant since 2000, according to the latest results of a rigorous international exam, despite a decades-long effort to raise standards, and help students compete with peers across the globe. According to the results of the U.S. Department of Education's periodic assessment exams, reading skills have barely moved in 47 years. And the achievement gap in reading between high and low performers is widening. Although the top quarter of American students have improved their performance on the exam since 2012, the bottom 10% lost ground, according to an analysis by the National Center for Educational Statistics, a federal agency. Here are some video clips to help us understand the importance of reading literacy. The first defines literacy. It has several components. This clip is less than a minute. The second video explains how the knowledge of reading grows as children progress. This is a school in University City, Missouri. The third clip explains why the state of Michigan is passing a law that prohibits moving a child to the 4th grade if they cannot read at a 3rd grade level. The station broadcasting this story is in Madison, Michigan.
Literacy. It's the combination of these things: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. According to the experts, these life skills are essential to the happiness, health, and wealth of individuals and society. which means it's vital young people have them. Having strong literacy skills gives people a better chance of finding a job and staying employed. Research shows it even makes a positive difference to health and well-being. Take reading. If you struggle with reading, it makes learning other skills more difficult. Reading matters, and as Prince's Trust programme leaders and volunteers, there's a lot you can do to help young people improve and feel more confident.
Kids come to schools from different backgrounds and with different levels of readiness. Kindergarten lays the foundation. But first grade is not about getting kids ready to read. First grade is about getting kids actually reading.
This is a good opportunity for you to look at the picture and see what you think that word might be. Good?
Grandma,
Must be exciting to see the breakthrough.
It is. It's the best part of first grade. Good.
It can't be that easy to learn to read.
It's not. It's not that easy. There's so many facets. I mean, there are so many different things that go into becoming a fluent and good reader.
The point is, kids are different in a lot of ways. I did learn to read faster than some, I know slower than others, but I have no idea how that happened. How I went from struggling to sound out "see, spot, run" in first grade to reading The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet just a few years later, a book I'm happy to say is still in the library. I progressed, I learned, I got over the hump. And as it turns out, for a lot of kids, that hump is third grade. So that was our next stop at Jackson Park, Ms. Johnson's third grade class.
Had enough room and you squeezed it there, make sure you wrote in a complete sentence.
You hear it all the time. How can a kid get through high school if they can only read at a third grade level? Nobody, it seems, ever says fourth grade or fifth grade. Always third grade. And here's why.
Kindergarten to second grade, children are learning to read. When they get to third grade, they begin to read for the purpose of learning. If you really read your activity sheet,
What the kids are doing here today, reading about the Girl Scouts, answering questions, learning history, understanding concepts, it's way different than it was in first grade.
It's huge. I mean, in first grade, I can still kind of help them a little bit along their way, but for the most part, when they're in third and fourth grade, they have to do it on their own.
And if you don't have that before third grade, then you end up in eighth grade on that third grade level.
You just fall further and further behind the other
Exactly.
kids.
If there's no interventions, if there's nothing significantly and consistently implemented, then you fall further and further behind.
Now, third grade and third grade reading are not the same thing. Some kids here are reading above grade level and some below. And today, kids are rarely held back. Instead, the teaching is tailored to their needs. Keep them progressing, keep them interested.
Bill is on its way to Governor Snyder's desk, designed to hold back third graders if they don't meet state guidelines for reading. Fox 47's Christopher Lane went to the Ingham County Intermediate School District to see how it feels about the bill.
Sarah Lawrence is going to see her daughter head off to school soon, and Lawrence is making sure she'll be ready by having her reading.
She recognizes little words, and mostly she's recognizing the letters, but we're trying.
Lawrence says her daughter is reading at home, and she thinks it will make a big difference when she starts school.
I definitely think she might be ahead of the curve, but we'll see.
M-STEP results showed that more than 50% of third graders are not considered proficient in English, and the state wants to do something about it with this law.
The law is really saying, please, use assessments or screeners so you know in real time when kids are falling behind and you're not waiting to third grade.
Because fourth grade is when students move from learning to read to reading to learn, if they can't read well, they'll fall behind. That's why this law says third graders who aren't proficient will be held back.
I think the focus for us is to instruct in a different way and make sure that if we know our intervention isn't working, we're changing that to make sure we get the right intervention.
No matter how you look at it, we are not getting the job done in making improvements in reading skills. Here's taken from my talk. You see a student not reading at his or her grade level by the end of the third grade is 4 times less likely to graduate high school on time and 6 times less likely if the student is from a low-income family. This prediction illustrates the dramatic impact of inadequate reading skills, something that happens before the third grade and affects a person the remainder of their life. In reading, there is no miraculous catch-up later as the person matures. This places the burden directly on the schools to make sure that every student can read at a third grade level at the end of the third grade. As we will see in later lessons, this implies a large increase in resources aimed at the early, pre-K, or even earlier students, usually students of need. Can students with learning difficulties or disabilities in reading comprehension learn to read? Here is a video that explains how they can be taught to read and don't slip through the cracks and get left behind. Lesson 12 ends after this video.
One of the most important skills that are learnt from the beginning of school is the ability to read, to make meaning from text and learn through reading. But what happens to a student when they have a learning difficulty or disability in reading and comprehension? What options are available to ensure that they don't slip through the cracks of the education system and are left behind? A reading difficulty is a deficit in processes relating to decoding, phonetic knowledge, word recognition, and comprehension. It seems simple. Let's teach every student in grade 1 exactly how to decode words, how to understand phonetics, how to recognize words, and how to comprehend. The problem is that for a long time we've believed that reading is a naturally acquired skill and that we don't need to explicitly teach how to read. But by that theory, we create a wait to fail model where we wait until we notice that a student is falling behind before we intervene. The issue here is that for students who have learning difficulties in reading, the cost of waiting until later years to identify a reading difficulty is far too great. Research suggests that delayed development of reading skills affects vocabulary growth, leads to missed opportunities to develop comprehension strategies, and alters the student's attitudes and motivation to read. And if that's not bad enough, children who exhibit qualities of being a poor reader by the end of their first year of primary school almost never acquire average level reading skills by the end of primary school. So why have we not always taught explicit phonics instruction? The argument around this issue is that explicit phonics instruction is not required because not every student needs the same amount of instruction to be able to read. And it's true, some students will come to their first year of primary school already having a strong ability to read. But for students with reading difficulties, being taught the foundations of reading is essential. Under the Disability Standards for Education, the Australian curriculum legislates that teachers are to ensure that all students with a disability are able to participate in the Australian curriculum on the same basis as their peers, through rigorous, meaningful and dignified learning programs. Thankfully, in recent years, we've realised that reading is actually a very complex, learnt skill and that explicit phonics instruction is beneficial for all early readers. A team of researchers in Scotland took 300 primary age students from a low socio-economic area and put half through an explicit phonics program and the other half through a traditional phonics program for 20 minutes a day over 7 years. They found that by grade 7, the explicit phonics students were 3 years and 6 months ahead of their average reading age and 7 months ahead of the students who learnt the traditional way. Not only that, of the students who were taught the explicit phonics program, only 5.6% were more than 2 years behind the average reading age for grade 7. So how do we let go of our traditional model and push towards a new and dynamic way of reading instruction? Schools have begun to adopt the 3-tier RTL model, starting early intervention for at-risk of failing readers. This model involves the explicit instruction of the 5 areas or pillars of reading: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. The first tier of the model is providing clear, explicit instruction of the 5 reading areas to the whole class. Tier 2 intervention offers a more intensified emphasis in smaller groups of students who are at risk of failing. And if the first 2 tiers aren't successful, then the student is placed into Tier 3, where they are provided with one-on-one intensive reading instruction. The RTL model enables a full initial screening process for all students, including measures which are highly predictive of later reading ability. The word identification fluency test has been found to be the most reliable form of assessment and can be seen in the ED Checkup, which tests oral reading fluency and takes about 15 minutes, and the more comprehensive early reading diagnostic assessment, which tests a multitude of reading skills taking up to 2 hours. However, teachers often have a good idea of what to look for when it comes to reading difficulties. A student with a reading difficulty may be less engaged in reading tasks, less confident in their ability to read, less willing to take risks in reading out new words, frustrated with difficult work tasks, or discouraged by their lack of success. However, no single description or profile can represent all individuals with reading difficulties or learning difficulties as a whole. So what are going to be the best strategies for helping students with reading difficulties? Strategies need to focus on decoding, increasing fluency, and improving comprehension. Our aim is to help students read to learn. For students to decode the text they are reading, they need to understand how the letters and sounds work. So use a phonics alphabet chart along with phonemic games and exercises. The charts can even be put on the walls around the room for reference in class time. Use mnemonic devices to remember tricky spellings. Make it fun. To build fluency, create reading lists of high-frequency words and run an activity where the student reads as many as they can for 1 minute, noting down how many correct words were read. Doing this day after day will show the student that they are improving and succeeding. Reading aloud together as a class for around 10 to 15 minutes per day can also help the student practice phrasing and intonation. While there are many assistive technologies such as the Speak tool for Microsoft and Mac, and apps such as Claro Speak Plus and Claro PDF Pro, which turns text into speech, making it easier than ever for students to hear written texts. To build comprehension, pre-teach vocabulary used in class by using analogies, synonyms, or visual aids. Have students use a dictionary or check online to confirm their correct use of harder words. Teach students how to generate questions about a text using a KWL chart. Have students think, pair, and share their responses to questions. Help students to make connections to personal experience, knowledge, and previous readings. And with all of our work with helping students with reading difficulties, context is key. We need to contextualize our instruction to the content they are learning, allowing students to transfer their new reading skills to other learning situations. With early intervention and hard work, we can stop students with reading difficulties being left behind in our schools.